Thank you. And I promise this is not a heavy topic because I've just listened to this morning's talks and they were heavy for somebody that doesn't have resource estimation drilling background. First of all, thank you for the introduction, Fergus. I would also like to thank DataMine for providing me the opportunity to present this paper that I actually wrote for the Mining Geology Conference earlier this year. And unfortunately, due to flight restrictions at the time, I didn't make it across to deliver this personally. So yeah, so this is the paper that I would have presented, and I thank you for listening. So it is Mine Reconciliation Standardisation, the R Factor series. And it will discuss a structural extension to the reconciliation process that we've already spoken about a little bit today with Harry Parker's F Factor series. R Factor series is the resource factor series, so this will actually make a bit more sense to a lot of the people in this room. We've labelled it R Factor to keep it in line with resource. So what we'll do is we'll examine conventional mining reconciliation. Okay, we need to get everybody on the same topic, make sure that we all understand what I'm talking about before we go into looking at the F series framework. And then I'll introduce this R series framework. We will look at a case study from Torex, and this is what I haven't been able to do in previous talks, is actually use this case study from El Limon Juarez mine complex in Mexico. A really great mine to do this case study on. What's important though is the F series and the R series framework are applicable to any mining operation. Okay, so I might be talking open pit here, but we can do open pit, underground, we can do both. It's fine, it does work. So as I said, what is mine reconciliation? When I'm talking mine reconciliation, I'm talking about the comparisons between the estimates and the measured values. So those estimates being our resource model, our reserve model, grade control, maybe even your mining movement, against measured values being a survey. Any of the data that comes out of the plant is a measured value. So what we're doing is we're seeking to identify resource estimation inaccuracies, sampling errors, poor plant performances, whatever it might be, and setting them up as standard KPIs so that we can then track how well those particular sections of the mine, nodes of the mine value chain are actually comparing over time. Okay, so the mining reconciliation, this won't be new to anybody, but what I wanted to do is just draw attention to the fact that there is so much data available. We have the resource reserve models, we have mine plans, we have grade control models, we have other types of models. Maybe it's an ore control model, maybe it is a muck pile model. The information from dispatch, we've got daily data coming from the plant, we may have a monthly reconciled data from the plant as well, and of course it goes through to transport and shipping. The case study that I'll deal with does really just look from the resource model through to the plant feed in this case. So whilst we've got all that data available, we may as well compare it, and that is what we're now going to look at doing. So to formalise the process, there have been prescribed reconciliation factors that have been recommended by numerous investigators, and this is a table from Harry Parker with his F series factors framework. And this is how I was introduced to the F factors, and to me it was like, yeah, okay, but having to read all of the information and then try and retain that was quite hard. So the next slide we'll go in and we'll show you a diagram that actually helps you embed what the F factors are and then how we can incorporate those R factors. I think with the absence of internationally recognised reconciliation factors, it's really hard to benchmark how one mine is performing against another mine. So, I've been a consultant for a long time. It's very hard for me to compare mine site A with mine site B or company A with company B. If we had some standardised factors, and this is going towards actually embedding standardisation, then we've got an opportunity to see how well we are comparing. And that's really what it's all about, tonnes, grade and metal. This is the diagram I was talking about. So this to me makes sense, and I hope it does to everybody else as well. And if it's one thing that you take away from today, it's this diagram and then with the R series embedded in it. The F series framework is really asking the question, did we meet reserve expectations for the month? If we look at the diagram, we've got the reserve model down the bottom here, the mine production, and then the mill feed. We've just got the simple F1, F2, and F3. And what we're trying to do is actually compare how well that reserve model has performed against the mine production and against the plant feed, and of course F2 mine production to plant feed. Now, the tier 1 operations are typically reporting factors of about 0.8 to 1.2. What we're trying to get to is 1. Okay, it's a ratio. It's a factor between 2 of the nodes on the mine value chain. Whether you want to call them F1, F2, it doesn't matter. As long as you're doing some comparisons, aiming for 1, but I would never want to see the number 1, because if the number 1 exists, then something's happening to rescale those numbers to get them to match. So I'm looking for the closest I can get to 1 without actually, not necessarily hitting 1 all the time. So why are the tier 1s reporting so well? It's usually because they've got a superior reserve estimate in place already. So they've been around for a long time, they know what they're doing, and they can tweak those estimates. They've also got reliable mining practices in place, as well as steady metal recoveries. Okay, so that's what we typically see, and that's only available through websites where you can actually get that information. So another problem is the transparency of this information and how well sites are actually performing against the reserve models. That's another topic for another day. So what I've done is we've embedded the R series factor, so that resource model smack bang in the middle of that F series framework. All we're trying to do is extend the framework. So we don't want to just report the 3, F1, F2, F3, but there's more to the story than that. And I always think of my mine value chain as starting at the resource model. Okay, that's what investors are actually buying into the company for. How well are you actually mining that resource model? And if we go down that ESG sort of road these days, you know, people are investing and assuming that you're actually going to mine that to the best of your ability. If you can't prove that you're doing that, then what are you doing? You shouldn't be mining it unless you can actually say that you're mining it the best way that you can. So we've put the resource model in the middle there, and we've now got an R1, an R2, and an R3, offering that improved resource modelling and estimation opportunity. So always looking to see how well we can actually improve the estimates. And what it does give me now is that all-inclusive cradle-to-grave reconciliation reporting. So from the resource model all the way through to the mill feed. Just breaking each of those R factors down. And again, rather than putting it into a table like Harry Parker had done, I've just tried to split it out into the diagram. But obviously R1 is that direct comparison between the reserve and the resource. And that really does just monitor the extent of those modifying factors that are changing over time. So those planned modifying factors. R2 is measuring the cumulative impact of the information effects, so the extra drilling that we're doing, the information that we now know about the ore body, dilution and ore loss. So of course, once we start blasting, once we start mining, we know that there's going to be some dilution and ore loss. And that's not necessarily always planned, it can be unplanned. So R2 is demonstrating how well your resource model predicts those mining practices, okay? Because now we're up in that mine production. We've got a lot that's happened between estimating that resource model and actually mining it. You can also see the impact of geostatistical adjustment factors linked to the assumptions in the mining selectivity, and that comes into play with the mine plans as well. Okay, the R3 has a use in planning as it tracks a cumulative operational or the short-term production monitoring and those short-term modifying factors for comparison with that long-term planning modifying factor like the R1. So we are looking at how well those planned and unplanned modifying factors are comparing. But wait, there's more. Because now we can start to break it down even more. So you're not just stuck with the R2, the R3, you can actually start to build it and say, okay, well, R3 is also a component of R2 times F2. So the actual modifying factors, so the actual things that are happening when we start to mine that ore body. But it's also equal to the planned modifying factors. So remember, we're looking at R3. So now we've got the plan from the resource model to the reserve, and then we've also got those modifying factors that we're putting in for performance and recoveries and so forth through the mill. So don't just think of R3 as being that direct resource to model. Start to break it down and just see if there's a certain component that's actually causing a problem. So yeah. Another really good one is the R2. So the R2, you know, the resource model to the mine production, as I said, there's a lot that happens between that model and the mine production. Things like the grade control model, okay? Like I said, there could be multiple models. I'm going to use the grade control model as an example here. R2A is the resource model to the grade control, and we could in fact have had an F1A, okay, a reserve model to a grade control model. Don't limit yourself to what's on the diagram. Just think outside the box and ways to break down the comparisons between different nodes of the mine value chain. So here R2A is the comparison between the resource model and the grade control model, which is all your drilling. Okay, you're drilling what you know about the ore body. R2B is the grade control model to the mine production, and again, that's, as I said before, that's talking about mining problems, so dilution or loss blasting, whatever it might be. What you'll see in the case study is that there's a big difference between R2A and R2B when we have a look at El Limon process. And just another example here is F2. And as I mentioned, F1, you could break it down, but F2 is a classic point where you could break it down because you've got a crusher in between the mine production, so what's coming out of the pit or the underground, and the mill feed. So if we stop it at the crusher and say F2A, what's come out of the, let's say the pit, for the instance, to the crusher, we know we may have stockpiling, okay, or stockpiling. So is that playing more of a part than F2B, which is really only dealing with the coarse ore stockpile, if there is one there? So again, F2 might look great as a number, but F2A might look terrible and F2B might look exceptional, which gives you that nice flat value. So really do just start to interrogate the differences in the numbers. So this is a case study from Torex Gold Resources, and they're a large Canadian gold producer. They're active in the Guerrero Gold Belt, Mexico, which is about an hour, 180 kilometers south of Mexico City, if anybody's been there, or about a 4-hour drive, I've been told. Their principal asset is the El Limon mine, and they're very rugged topography, okay, so quite difficult mine, but they are mining it well. Why have we chosen ELG? Because they have a really robust F1, F2, F3 reconciliation reporting framework in place. So they've been gathering data for a number of years. So what we were able to do is go and have a look at how those F1, F2, F3s were comparing, and then embed the R factors and see if we can actually get some more information around what we're seeing. So to keep it simple, I've literally just placed their results, their F1, F2, and F3 onto that F factors diagram. And what that's telling us is that the factors on F1 and F3, actually not F1 and F2, sorry, are trending above unity. So remember, I'm looking at around that one. Over the long term, they're trending over unity, which is consistent with a conservative reserve forecast. Right? The F2 chart is plotting just that metal reconciliation factor because we're dealing with the plants and they're only reconciling it, that metal component. What you will see there also is that F1 and F3 kind of mirror one another, and that's because they're doing some stockpile adjustments based on what they're getting out of the plant. And that's fine, as long as we can explain why we're seeing differences in the numbers or in the charts. So let's have a look at each of these now with the R factor series. So you can see here, we have those F series. What we've done is we've actually pulled out the resource model and we've included that grade control model. So we want to see the impacts of how well they're comparing against the F factors. So if we start at R1, which is the resource model to the reserve model, you can see we've got that lower grade for higher tons to give us that near 1 for the metal, and you can also see that it does not change over time, and that's because they haven't actually changed much in the estimation way, estimation or the modifying factors on those resources and reserves, which is fine. Not much to tell there, but it does also, sorry, it does tell me that it is a conservative reserve that they've got there with that lower grade. R2 tells a completely different story. Okay, so now we're starting to look at the resource model to the mine production, and as I said before, there's a lot going on between that resource model and the production, but we know that it doesn't impact the reserve model. Okay, so I could be doing the same thing here with the reserve model as I'm doing with the resource model. So you can see there's a threefold shift. So September 2019, we see the first one where the tons and grade and metal produced start to diverge, where that tons in the blue line is greater than the grade and the metal that's coming down. Before May 2020, it starts to actually join together and start to look really good. So we went back to to Torex and said, look, we've identified that we've got some changes here. Can you tell us what that would be? Without showing them the chart that we'd actually generated, okay? What we saw when we actually split that up, that R2 up into that grade control to the resource and the production to the grade control, and I'm going to let's just look at the grade control to the resource first. You can see that there's quite a divergence between the tons and the grade, but it does start to come back in line around September 2020. Contrary to the fact that that R2B, it kind of looks like it's pretty consistent for the whole time. Still a conservative, you know, lower tons for a higher grade, and that does go with their selective mining that they're doing on site. But that R2A was the one where we went, something's happened here, that you've made a change and it's come back in line. Now, if you'd got to May 2020 and you were just like, what's happening? You need to be able to monitor and be able to bring those lines back together. What that was they actually started to do some more infill drilling in their grade control model in around May 2020. So they got a better understanding of their ore body. They got more information. They were able to do a better estimate on that grade control model, and that is really what brought it back in line, as well as changing treating two different ore bodies as different, estimating it differently. And I'll summarize that better in the conclusion. And then just looking at that R3, the R3 being the resource model to the mill feed. When comparing that R3 to R1, as I said before, the difference between them is between the assumed, the R1, and the actual, being the R3 mining factors. They haven't changed too much over the last 3 years. So any variation that we see here is purely down to the pit operations. It has nothing to do with that R1, which is that resource to reserve component, because we can break that R3 down into different ways. So the conclusion that we had from that, and like I said, we did go back and we asked questions before we presented the actual charts to them, and it was around that adding that information from the drilling back into the grade control model, and that separation of the structural domains for the estimation to improve those estimation parameters. So while a dollar value is not being presented here for the improvements in this case study, I think it becomes pretty clear that when you keep the grade and the tons in control, it's a more predictable metal outcome. Okay, so you just need to control those tons and grades and be comparing them over time. So whereas numerous attempts have been made to introduce global reconciliation standards only when they offer actionable insights. Okay, so there's no point putting out standards if they don't give anybody any information. Only when they offer actionable insights are they likely to be uniformly adopted by the mineral sector. And it's a huge push at the moment to try and standardise these reconciliation factors. Yeah. With the these R factor series, they do present new opportunities for standardisation with their ability to quantify the impact of the information effects of drilling, dilution and ore loss. And I guess with the extended framework and the introduction of an extended framework, a more rational discussion of reconciliation benchmarking should eventuate. Fingers crossed. I will acknowledge my co-authors on the paper. It's Jeff Booth, Tarrant Elkington and Bill Shaw, and I would like to acknowledge Torex Gold for providing us with the data for the case study. Thank you.